Welcome back to IOS CCIE Security version 5 ATC class, the online version. Today we're going to start the IOS Firewall topic. Is going to be our first main course within the course series of the ATC. So to begin with, we're going to first speak about which topics will be covered, like what will we let's say include in this mini course. And then we're going to speak about what preparation resources you can use to gain a better understanding of the technologies additionally to this video series. Now, as a prerequisite, as we were saying also yesterday, I will need to make sure that you have a good working knowledge of routing and switching technologies in general, and nothing else but a very, very basic knowledge of security technologies, like even CCNA level is going to be good enough to make sure you get the most out of this mini course, the IOS Firewall. So, as I was saying, to begin, we're going to speak about what will we cover. We're going to speak initially about router planes. So before going to the security aspects, we have to identify what are the router planes and for which traffic each of those router planes in charge of. We're going to define the control plane, the management plane, data plane, and the services plane. Then we're going to continue with the access list, both IPv4 and IPv6. We're going to extend the time-based lock and key reflexive. I'm going to see that most of them we will be reusing them later through other topics, so it is very important and key to understand how each of them worked individually and what is the purpose of it. Afterwards, we're going to go to partially, we're going to start let's say the data plane security features. So we're going to speak about IPv4 and IPv6 address spoofing. I'm going to touch base in here a couple of RFCs that define some rules in order to prevent address spoofing, and also about unicast RPF. Then we're going to go to other data plane security feature. We're going to speak about a couple of, let's say, options for regular, simple, very simple denial of service protection, like ICMP attacks, TCP/SYN attacks, SYN flat attacks, fragmentation attacks, policy routing, TCP intercept. Primarily, we're defining this because, as we're going to see, a couple of these options, which are also standalone features on the IOS router, a couple of them will be actually built in our zone-based policy firewall, or pretty much our main topic within the IOS Firewall mini course. So it's important to grasp the understanding of this feature before we see how they work within the zone-based policy firewall. Then we're going to go to the zone-based policy firewall implementation. We're going to speak about both modes, routed and transparent, application inspection as well, and high availability. I'm going to pretty much touch base with all of the zone-based policy firewall features out there. This is just a let's say a couple of the main things we're gonna touch base with. Then we're going to go to NAT. We're going to speak about both network address translation. So NAT means translating or changing only the layer 3 header of the IP packet, and also about NAPT, or network address port translation, which means when you do NAPT, you're going to translate both the layer 3 header and the layer 4 header of the IP packet. And of course, we're going to speak about both the IOS router implementation NAT types. We speak about the main-based NAT. That's going to be your IP NAT inside outside, and then the mainless based NAT, which is going to be like your IP NAT enabled configuration wise. I'm going to see why would you use one over the other, what is the new version, what are the restrictions, and so on. And of course, within those lines, we're going to speak about the initial, of course, NAT scope, NAT44, which what that means is that when you NAT a IPv4 address into another IPv4 address. Then I'm going to speak also about NAT66, although it's not supported on the iOS devices, just a basic idea of what is the scope and functionality in there. And then, of course, about the legacy NATPT and its replacement, which is called NAT64 and NAT46. So NAT624 or NAT426. So the last option is going to be whenever you want to be able to move packets between IPv4 and IPv6 networks, it means you got to do 6 to 4 and 4 to 6 NAT. Afterwards, we're going to go to pretty much the control plane security. We're going to go to, first of all, IPv4 and IPv6 routing protocol security. I'm going to speak about all options in there: RIP for IPv4, RIP-NG for IPv6, OSPF version 2 for IPv4, OSPF version 3 for IPv4 and IPv6, EIGRP for IPv4, IPv6, and of course BGP as well. And then we're gonna touch base also with a specific BGP feature used for denial of service attacks, BGP remotely triggered black hole filtering, or BGP RTBH. And then I'm gonna continue with the control plane security. We're gonna get into the details of device hardening, saving or protecting the CPU and the memory of the router, about SPD, local policy routing, and finally the let's say the main topic in the control plane security is going to be control plane policing, which is now obsolete and it's replaced by control plane protection. And last but not least, we're going to touch base with the management plane security portion. We're going to speak about the management plane protection, which is like a sub-module of the control plane protection feature, the SSH, Telnet, VTI lines, IOS banners. There are some topics, of course, which are supported by IOS, and we're not going to touch base with them in the IOS Firewall topic. Things like NTP, syslog, Armon, SNMP, and NetFlow. We're going to touch base with those topics in the infrastructure security mini course. The main idea being that we're going to touch base with those features for both the IOS Firewall and the ASA Firewall. And we first have to pretty much describe and outline what is the purpose of each of those technologies, how do they work, and then I'm going to see them live for both the iOS and the ASA Firewall. Now, as your preparation resources, so even though I gave a list of books in the introduction of the course yesterday, the relevant books for the IOS Firewall are going to be the Cisco Firewall books, Cisco Firewall's books, Cisco Router Firewall Security, and Router Security Strategies Securing IP Network Traffic Planes. Now, before we get going, just a couple of things I want to show you in here about those books. They are quite, let's say, old books, and it's not necessarily needed you have to read everything. I'm going to go to my Safari subscription in order to show exactly what you should touch base with. So let's go to Safari Online. So Safari Online. Okay, so Cisco Firewall, that's going to be one book in here. It's written by Alexander MSP Moraes. This was one of the people within Cisco that engineered the IOS Firewall solutions, both CBAC and zone-based policy firewall. So you'd go to this book in here. Let's go to continue reading. So this book is going to be used primarily for a couple of things. You don't necessarily need to read the whole thing in here. So you need to make sure you read chapter 1 to have a base introduction of general firewall network security. Then chapter 2 is kind of like obsolete now because it speaks about legacy devices on Cisco. Configuration fundamentals, I would say also it's obsolete now. You need to go to chapter 4 then, learning the tools, know the firewall. General firewalling network technology, chapter 5. Then you don't need DSA in here, so chapter 7 can be excluded. Chapter 8, classic IOS Firewall, this is going to be nothing else but CBAC. Ideally, you would read what CBAC was, because you're going to see that zone-based policy firewall is going to be CBAC plus reflexive CBAC plus TCP intercept plus additional features, of course. And then clearly the point of interest is going to be chapter 10, which is going to be zone-based policy firewall, the zone-based policy firewall section. And then chapter 11 as well, additional protection mechanism. Chapter 11, it's okay. Application inspection for zone-based policy firewall, chapter 12. Now for inspection of voice protocols, you can read about it, but it's not really required for what we're going to be doing and getting in the lab exam. Identity, also, you may read that in there to be able to understand authentication proxy. You're going to use it later on throughout the week. And then, of course, a couple of insights on how firewalls deal with multicast, chapter 15. That's going to be likewise an interesting read. And of course, chapter 16 about IPv6 support for firewalls. Whatever stated in there may not be 100% valid today, but pretty much a good introduction of firewalls and IPv6 would be good enough in there. So you have like chapter 2, which you don't need, chapter 3, chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 13. And then chapter 17, integrations doesn't matter. So you have like, give it or take, like 10 chapters pretty much in there to read upon. Now the additional book, which is called, the other book, which was called Cisco, let's go back. So let's go home. And let's speak about the Cisco router security. Start reading now. And looking at the chapters, you would have to go in here and, for example, you're going to find things that are going to speak about, of course, things like disabling unnecessary services, chapter 4 in here. Then it's going to be chapter 6, 7 is going to be about usual basic ACLs. So ACLs is going to be in chapter 6 and 7. Then on part 4, chapter 8. So part 4 starts the, let's say, so-called stateful inspection of traffic on the IOS router. And then they start with the chapter 8 of reflexive ACL, then chapter 9 CBAC. As I was saying, CBAC is a chapter 9 CBAC would be a quick read, just ideally if you have never dealt with CBAC, to understand what were the challenges with CBAC and then how those got fixed in zone-based policy firewall. Now, so chapter 10 was not going to be required for you because you don't really care about URL filtering with CBAC anymore. Now you have a couple of things on part 5, address transition and firewalls. That's going to be, part 5 is going to be relevant to the NAT implementation. That's going to be interesting and a good introduction in there, good read. Then moving forward, the important part we're going to see in here is pretty much a lot of, let's say, so-called legacy stuff, but it's important to understand the features that we are using today. So then chapter 13 is going to be your lock and key ACLs, which is like dynamic access list. And then those got replaced by authentication proxy. So chapter 14, we're going to be authentication proxy. This feature replaced dynamic access list or lock and key access list. Then chapter 15, run protocol protection. However, being an older book, they don't touch base with the new, let's say, security features, especially for IPv6. And then on part 7, we have a couple of inputs on denial of service protection. You can skip the chapter 16 IDS, and then logging events for, we're going to do this, I'm going to give you another book for logging in general for, let's say, infrastructure security. And then about pretty much that's it. You don't need to know about IPsec, IPsec remote access. You can skip those in there. So that's going to be primarily for your base, let's say, a couple of legacy features which are still there in the IOS firewall code. And then the final book is going to be the one with router planes, securing which likewise, technically speaking, you don't need to read the whole book. Router security strategies, going to reading. So in here you need to pretty much read part 2. You can go a bit in part 1 to grasp a basic understanding about chapter 2, especially about threat models for IP networks. And then the important part is going to be clearly part 2. Fully will speak about all of the planes of the router, data plane, control plane, management plane, services plane. So chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then of course the everything else, part 3 and part 4 is just optional. It's case studies. You can just keep those. But make sure you read part 2. That's the primary scope of reading and getting into this book in here. As I was saying, if you, instead of buying the books, you can go ahead and buy a subscription. It's going to be way cheaper in the end because you're going to need to read a lot of books back and forward. Those are the books. RFCs, of course, we're going to speak about as we're going to move forward. About access lists, there are no RFCs. But of course, moving forward, we're going to get, for example, NAT or other features. So we're going to touch base with a couple of RFCs, or also to IP spoofing. We're going to name a couple of them. That's going to be your second best resource to understand, that the standard technologies. Then, of course, Cisco representations, looking as for IOS Firewall, look at older Cisco representations like the ones from 2014 or 13, because nowadays it's not a big emphasis anymore, of course, on these features. And of course, least but not last is going to be your, let's say, iOS configuration guide, Cisco's configuration guides examples. And then we have in there both the iOS configuration guide, so for regular ISR routers like the old, let's say 3900, 2900 or 1900, and of course about iOS XE. So in the lab we have both iOS via iOS-V and iOS XE via CSR 1000V. And then of course there are a couple of differences, like sometimes iOS supports some features that iOS XE does not support. Otherwise, iOS 6 is going to support other features which iOS doesn't support. Now, the idea behind this mismatch of supported features is that iOS 6C is going to be pretty much it is the new iOS, and it lacks some of the legacy features. Cisco, as they invented iOS 6C, they try to look forward and don't, let's say, migrate the legacy features. But then, of course, iOS 6C being the future has additional features which regular iOS does not support. So either way, those are going to be your primary, let's say, doc and preparation resources for any kind of iOS Firewall topic, except as I was saying, the NTP, Syslog, NetFlow, SNMP, which we're going to touch base with them in another mini course.